I would say so. At 8 o'clock when the earthquake happened, we weren't standing here in this exact position in Hatay, but we're told that when the earthquake hit, the people there's a little bit of a tent city set up in front of me, and behind me is a field hospital. The people came out of their tents and they came out on the streets, and they were really quite nervous about what was happening because, of course, these are people that have been so traumatized by these earthquakes that happened 2 weeks ago. They really didn't know what to do. They didn't know if more were to come. And then as far as the field hospital, there were a lot of ambulances coming in with new injuries. Now, we are told that those injuries were mostly related to people running to the streets and falling, kind of like what I was saying about what the people were doing here in the tents. What people were doing on the streets in Hatay were just running out to the streets and coming together, and that's how a lot of them ended up falling and getting some of the injuries that had them seen here in the field hospital. But luckily, many of them were not major trauma injuries. The ones that were bigger injuries ended up going in a helicopter. We saw the helicopter a couple times since we've been here to other hospitals in Adana and such cities. But as the time went on, I would say by about 1 in the morning was perhaps the last time we saw some ambulances come by. People did go back in their tents. The injuries calmed down as well. So it does seem that people have been able to put their fears to rest and actually get some sleep. Yes, indeed. I don't think the tents exactly pose any danger to people. I mean, the idea is that most of the tents, at least the tents that I can see right now, are in kind of a general and open area. That is the idea. That's what authorities say to do when things happen. If you're outside, try to go to an area where there are no tall buildings around you, so that if any buildings do fall, then there aren't going to be any issues and that you're going to be safe from debris. In fact, we understand that of the about 300 people that are injured, 20 of them critically injured. Likely those injuries were sustained from some sort of falling debris. Perhaps people were staying in their houses when they weren't supposed to, and perhaps people were hit by some debris. And as I was saying before, some of the injuries here in the field hospital, people were running when they got out of their houses, and that's how some of these injuries occurred. So no, these tents are completely safe. I think just for a lot of people, it was remembering that one night 2 weeks ago when they were awoken by these earthquakes, and their first instinct was simply to run, and that's why so many folks were doing exactly that. Well, I think in the first instinct, I should tell you that there still are rescue crews on scene for many places in Hatay. We're told that search and rescue efforts are underway, and that's because some buildings did collapse. We are understanding that there are still some people under the rubble. Last we heard, at about 1 in the morning, there were people actually rescued from underneath that rubble, and so we're told those efforts are still ongoing. Now, those are fresh efforts besides the ones that were still ongoing in Hatay from the search and rescue efforts 2 weeks ago from those massive earthquakes. Now, beyond those kind of first aid emergency situations, people all over the country are, of course, receiving many types of aid, including psychological support, including shelter. Many of these tent cities have been set up. We're also told that many containers are on the way to Turkey, so people can sort of shift out of the tents and into these containers, which of course are much better suited for living and are going to have an easier time getting heat and staying warm and just staying safe from the elements. People are, of course, also receiving food multiple times per day, and there's just so many different organizations set up here in southern Turkey to make sure that all specific needs are really taken care of in this time of disaster. So I would definitely say that if you are to drive down a street in Gaziantep and if you are to drive down one in Hatay, it's really night and day. Obviously, tragedies aren't meant to be compared, and the situation in Gaziantep is dire as it is. However, not as many buildings have fallen. We haven't seen the same high death toll. So I'm sure if that's what my colleague is saying in Gaziantep, I can only assume that it is much worse here, because when you drive here through the cities of Hatay, it is quite difficult to drive through any street that doesn't have nearly all of its buildings completely fallen. And I will also add, as I was saying earlier, in Hatay, the search and rescue efforts never ended as they did in Gaziantep from 2 weeks ago. And that just speaks to the amount of destruction and the death toll that we see here and the devastation, because even if search and rescue efforts are still going on here in Hatay, that means that we haven't yet shifted into that new role of rebuilding as perhaps they have in Gaziantep. And so people, I would say, are even worse off, because when you haven't been able to yet switch, you're still in that holding on to hope that perhaps some of your loved ones are alive, while still likely logically knowing that that's not going to happen.
The scale of the buildings that aren't occupied at the moment, it's obviously a very slow burning fuse when it comes to that one. Obviously, until yesterday, the priority was, of course, checking the rubble, still looking for survivors, but as we know, there were survivors on Saturday. There haven't been since. We've now moved into the next phase of this whole scenario, which is looking after those people who have survived and then dealing with the buildings that either need to be demolished. As the government has been saying, there are possibly 100,000 or so that are either already half fallen down or will need to be demolished anyway, and a massive rebuild needs to be undertaken. But at the same time, there is a slow, obviously, process from what we've been understanding from people in this city, which is relatively unscathed by comparison, of giving the okay to certain buildings and certain areas. But it doesn't really matter if you get the okay from whatever authority. When you feel an earthquake, you feel an earthquake, and there is this psychological, there's a trauma in many people here, and there's a fear that we felt, and that all of our colleagues have been feeling as well, when something strikes, and it didn't strike with the same violence here that people have felt in other areas.
The question about whether it's an aftershock or not is debatable. I mean, it's an academic exercise, really. The stress in that area has all changed since the first earthquake, and any subsequent earthquake in that short time after the original earthquake, to many, is considered an aftershock, but it doesn't lessen the impact of this terrible event. So the area where all of these earthquakes is happening is the border of a number of tectonic plates, and so the stress builds up greatly at those plate boundaries, and that initial earthquake that occurred, the 7.8, ruptured a large area, several hundred kilometres, triggering lots of aftershocks, and that follow-up magnitude 7.5 event also. So all of the stress is changing in this area, and the strength of the rock has all shifted. So the whole dynamic of that plate boundary region has changed. So there are some areas that are now more prone to having earthquakes triggered by that stress change, and other areas that have changed to be less likely to happen. But the modelling of that is quite difficult, and it will take a while to settle into which areas are more prone. But certainly aftershocks to this event and to the original events are expected to continue for weeks, if not months. It's within reason to expect that there will be large aftershocks. When you have a big event like a 7.8, usually you would expect to have maybe up to 10 times as many events that are about up to a magnitude unit smaller. So, 10 magnitude 6 events following that magnitude 7.8. And, we've seen a few magnitude 6s already, so there is an expectation that more could occur. And then you would have maybe 100 magnitude 5s and 1,000 magnitude 4s, and it goes on like that. And it does reduce over time, but that whole stress change from these large events is creating a situation that is very dynamic, and particularly in a high-stress region at the Anatolian fault plate border. So, these earthquakes will definitely continue on. We can't, unfortunately, predict what the magnitude is, but we do know that some larger events could possibly occur.
Adam, now getting